Today we're going to start with a little bit further in the social science resource guide from section 1, where I didn't really get a chance to get through everything, and Alex Solis's lessons didn't really get through everything either. So we're starting on page 16 in the social science resource guide. And what we're looking at is, in this video, the early Cold War in Europe. Now, we've heard this phrase, the Iron Curtain, numerous times, right? This comes from this 1946 speech from Winston Churchill. President Truman is actually here at this speech, which takes place in the United States at a college town in Fulton, Missouri. And the phrase that's quoted all the time from Churchill is, "A shadow has fallen upon the great scenes, so lately lighted by the Allied victory. From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent." Churchill in this speech is talking about how if the United States doesn't actively fight communism, then all of the work that they did in Europe against Hitler and Nazism is going to be for nothing. And of course, people don't want that. People don't want the World War II investments and sacrifices to go for nothing. So another thing that Churchill says at this speech is that you cannot have this policy of appeasement. Appeasement was a policy that just kind of said, leave him alone, let him be, and he won't attack and destroy Europe, which we all know Hitler tried to do. He tried to take over Europe. So appeasement in Churchill's speech is a terrible, terrible idea. All right, so here's an image on the upper left here of Churchill over here with the cigar and Truman in the car in Fulton, Missouri. So once we have this Iron Curtain established, the question sort of comes naturally, what makes up the nations on both sides? So on the eastern side of the Iron Curtain, we have what are called the Soviet satellites, or the Eastern Bloc. These are countries that previously had freedom. And Stalin says, we're going to start controlling these nations. So Stalin has some coups happen. Czechoslovakia, he succeeds in ousting a democratic government. And so immediately Czechoslovakia is part of the Eastern Bloc under the control of the Soviet Union. Here's some other countries: Poland, Hungary, Bulgaria, Romania, East Germany. What happens here is communist minorities that already exist in these nations, they receive additional support from the Soviet government, financial support, military support. And what happens is these minorities get control of these countries, sometimes with elections, but more often just by taking over. And we saw this happen recently in the country of Ukraine, where Russian-backed forces assisted the takeover of the country of Ukraine. Okay, so what happens when the Soviet Union takes over these countries? One-party communist rule, dictators who are ruthless, police surveillance. In other words, people's choices are removed, and it's much more dangerous to live here if you disagree with the communist leaders. There is one exception to the nations who get sort of swept into Soviet control, and this exception is Yugoslavia. There's already a communist leader here. His name is Josip Broz Tito, and he is already popular. He wins an election and wins power with the people's support. The Soviet Union tries to control Yugoslavia and continue to do what it successfully does in these other Eastern Bloc nations by running the country through its Communist International Organization. But Tito says, no, I'm popular enough. I don't need you guys running my country. I'll run my country on my own. And Tito reaches out to the United States and says instead, hey, I'm trying to fight being taken over by the Soviet Union. Will you guys support me in this? And even though the United States would not necessarily agree that communism is a good thing, that would be against their policies, at this time, especially. But because they offer to stand up to the Soviet Union, the United States grants some support for Yugoslavia. Okay, next we're going to talk about a policy that the United States and Europe moved into, and this policy is called containment. This is the idea that we are going to try to contain the spread of communism. The person who you want to remember the name of related to containment is George F. Kennan. So Stalin's trying to increase his power in Eastern Europe, and the Truman administration, including George Kennan, who is stationed in Moscow, he comes up with this idea that containment is the best idea. Okay, so he successfully predicts what Stalin's plans with the USSR will be globally, more globally. So he says expansion isn't going to be confined to Europe, which we've seen it already spread through Eastern Europe, but instead he's going to go to Africa and he's going to go to Asia, where all of these nations who previously were colonies of typically Great Britain, they're no longer colonies. They've been decolonized. And so there's independence happening, and these countries are newly independent. And both the United States and the USSR see opportunity there. They want to control them. They want to have, at a minimum, the support of them. They want to have an influence on this new world order and have either democracy or communism be what takes hold in those countries. Importantly, Kennan says we want to try to do this without any general military conflict. We want to try to contain communism without military conflict. Then the United States, according to Kennan, had to develop this comprehensive program promoting United States values and interests. This is where all of these ambassadors that show up in the music section come into play. We have to show that our culture, that our results are better than what comes out of communism. Okay. Next, we need to talk about the Truman Doctrine. The Truman Doctrine says essentially that the United States is going to intervene anywhere that local communists backed by the Soviet Union seek to sow confusion and disorder. So in other words, if communists are not necessarily backed by the Soviet Union, we're maybe going to turn a blind eye. Take this under the light of the United Nations as well, where the countries of the United Nations agreed to help stand up to aggressive forces. This takes over, it replaces the Monroe Doctrine, and the Monroe Doctrine had a lot more to do with isolationism and not getting involved in global politics. So the Truman Doctrine flips that on its head. Now, we know that the Marshall Plan is going to come into play here. Because of World War II, a lot of these nations have been bombed. A lot of their industry is destroyed. And so we start, as the United States, we start with supporting the countries of Turkey and Greece, and we give them some financial aid to help them in order to keep them from being vulnerable to these communists who are also stepping up to help. George Marshall is the person who brings this to the forefront, and that's why it ends up being called the Marshall Plan. The actual name was the European Recovery Program, but this is called the Marshall Plan more commonly. And we're bringing $13 billion of financial aid to Northern and Western European countries. Vital to this, actually I'm going to go here, other nations that received help from the Marshall Plan: Sweden, Switzerland, West Germany, those nations that we typically think of as our allies. This is interesting. The Marshall Plan was also offered to these nations like the Soviet Union and its satellite states. But in order to accept the money, these countries had to agree to certain things that were more capitalist in nature. So all of these nations say, no way, I'm not going to take this money, because they don't want to undermine the Soviet plans to spread communism in these countries. You may or may not remember that when Yalta happened, the three countries that were at Yalta, the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union, they agreed to sort of chop up Germany, and it had 4 administration zones or occupation zones. 3 were occupied by the United States, Great Britain, and France, and then the 4th was occupied by the Soviet Union. Well, these 3 Western nations, the United States, Great Britain, and France, they decide to just put it all into one. And of course, Stalin doesn't like that. One of his reactions is to blockade the city of Berlin. Now, I wish I had a good map to show you right here, but Berlin was smack dab in the middle of the Soviet occupation zone in Eastern Germany. But Berlin itself was split. And so what happens is Stalin literally closes off everything that gave Western Germany access to Western Berlin. This is pretty awful for the people who live there, and he knows that this is going to cause a lot of problems. His goal is that the United States actually abandons Berlin, but it fails miserably. It actually it blows up in his face because the United States and Britain do what's called the Berlin Airlift, and they drop supplies into Western Berlin for a year, more than a year. And so instead of persuading the Americans to give up Western Germany, it actually made the people of West Germany feel even more loyal, and it made the United States even more committed to its goal. So this is important right here. For the remainder of the Cold War, the 2 German states, Eastern and Western, would exist side by side in the divided city of Berlin, would become a symbol of that ideological divide. Okay, so after this we have the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. This basically is a security pact that says the United States will defend any other member nation against an invasion or aggression by a Soviet aggressor. So this is a formal defensive alliance, okay? This is probably the vital part of this. Each member state pledges to come to the aid of any other member state. This has ended up in the United States situation kind of being a lopsided agreement, because the United States commits to coming to the aid of countries that may or may not even actually have much in the way of strategic importance to the United States. America is now very formally involved in global politics. The Soviets, of course, are not going to let this just sit, so in 1955, they create a similar security alliance called the Warsaw Pact. This includes those Soviet satellite nations. Let's see, continuing forward here. We start to switch from Kennan's ideas of just containment to Paul Nitz. He replaces Kennan and comes up with this NSC 68. This is a much more hawkish view. So he sees the Cold War as what's called a zero-sum battle. So that means that no one can win without someone else losing. This sets the stage for the Korean War. It also allows the opening of this psychological defense and more propaganda in the use of American actions against the Soviet Union. Down here, we see something that we saw in the other art sections and music, the Smith-Mundt Law. This creates the United States Information Agency, and that's where all of the information is spread through the world.